Welcome to the Convocation Unscripted, a podcast at the intersection of religion, culture, and politics. My name is Jemar Tisby, and I am joined today by my colleagues, Butler Bass.
Hey, Jemar.
And Kristin Du Mez.
Hey, Jemar. Good to be with you in person.
Absolutely. And Robert P. Jones.
Indeed, in person.
Here we are in person. So for folks who followed the Convocation Unscripted, you know that generally we're on Zoom. We're all in these four little boxes and we're talking to each other through a screen. But for the very first time, we are together in person here in Washington, D.C. And Kristin, it's kind of your fault. Or I'll say, we can give you credit.
Yes.
So why are we all here together in the same room in D.C.?
Yeah, so we are here for the Test of Faith Summit, which was held over the last couple of days to launch a statement on Christian faith and democracy. We decided that we could not take this for granted any longer. Many of us are in spaces where we're seeing the erosion of commitment to democratic norms, institutions, and we're seeing that Christian leaders and Christians themselves are often spearheading those attacks. So we thought it was time to make a case for democracy as Christians, a theological case for democracy. And so several of us worked for many, many months. We had Catholic scholars, we had Protestant scholars, evangelicals, Orthodox, all coming together and digging deep into our common theology, into the scriptures to say, why is democracy not the only choice for a functioning government, but our preferred choice? And why do we think it is consistent with deeply held Christian values? So imago Dei, loving your neighbor as yourself, loving your enemies, telling the truth, these sorts of things. And importantly for me as a Calvinist, taking into account human sin and taking into account corruption of power and really wanting to protect our government, protect our society, frankly, from Christians themselves on our bad days. And part of the backdrop here, just part of it, is the growing Christian nationalist movement, which insists on Christian supremacy. And it wants to take our democratic government and instead place it in the hands of Christians and a particular type of Christian. And it was important to us to speak out against that as Christians and saying this is actually harmful to the Christian faith and it's harmful to our fellow citizens. It's harmful to the very fabric of our nation. And so we made our case. We put together this document. Hundreds of faith leaders have already signed. It's available online. You can go to the Test of Faith Summit and you can sign your own name. First, you can read it and see if it articulates your own feelings and clarifies some issues for you, and you might be able to find it useful in your own spaces. So that was the document itself, the statement on Christian faith and democracy. And then we held this summit, invited all sorts of faith leaders, scholars such as yourselves, and activists to reflect on the state of our democracy, the health of our democracy, and the health of the Christian faith in this political moment. So you all were invited to the table and were able to participate. So Robby, what did you address in your panel?
Yeah, well, it was great. I mean, it was really a who's who, I think, of people working in this space. So not only was the 2-day event, right? Things across Thursday and Friday. We had you were on a panel on Thursday. Diana and Jemar and I were on a panel together yesterday, Friday. And it's what was interesting to me is just the idea that I think for so many, like for generations, in fact, we've kind of taken for granted Christian support for democracy, right? That sounds like an uncontroversial statement that might not even need to be made. And it's we were on the panel with Simone Campbell, Sister Simone Campbell, and she was saying some things like, well, we actually thought a lot of this had been solved, right? Vatican II, right? The compatibility of democracy and Catholicism, and in the Protestant world, right? That, yeah. And it occurs to me that, one reason why this is needed, it may be that we've just taken it for granted for so long until it's under threat. We've forgotten why we really support it. It's just such a knee-jerk thing that we've forgotten the principles behind it. And so I think it's a really healthy move to help us think about that and to remember that, you can't just go to the Bible and read democracy out of the New Testament or the Hebrew Bible, right? It's not in there. In fact, there's more monarchy in those texts than there are democracy. And how do we get from those old models to the models that we have? And it is theological conversations like about sin, right? And the need for restraining our worst impulses. And of course, democracy is not perfect, but at the end of the day, it's a balancing act. And there's a kind of thing of art we've lost that I really appreciate hearing all three of these things is a kind of prudence, right? Practical wisdom that led us to democracy, right? Christian principles married to prudence and serious conversations about sin and structures and all of that and how we know we work, right? On our better days and our worst days. Yeah.
I love that you brought in prudence. Often, as a historian, historians' favorite virtue is usually empathy, right? You have empathy for your historical subjects, and you're trying to understand the world through their eyes. For me, I love prudence. Prudence, understanding how the world works, so that what we are trying to achieve isn't undermined by the processes that we're using. And so I love your use of prudence, and we have to understand history. We have to understand the reality right in front of us in order to achieve the ends that we're trying to achieve.
It was amazing how much history came up.
Yes.
In all of these conversations. And Diana, so the three of us, Robby, you and me, we were on the same panel talking across divisions, but you had a unique role.
That was really hard.
Yeah, you were the moderator of a 4-person panel plus yourself. I thought you did an excellent job. So what was your approach? What were you trying to emphasize and bring out?
I wasn't exactly sure what I was trying to emphasize or bring out, because I looked at this extraordinary group of people and I thought,
yeah,
okay.
in other words, it was Vashti McKenzie was on there as well, Bishop Vashti McKenzie. Yeah.
So it was the three of us, me in the moderator role, and then Simone Campbell and Vashti McKenzie. And so I thought, oh my goodness. These people need no moderation at all, and they can have a conversation about democracy with being blindfolded.
Yeah, and about 50 people in the audience could have been on the panel.
That's
right, because it was just so amazing. Yeah. But the topic we had was talking across divides, and I actually started out with just a few remarks. I took the moderator privilege, and I pointed out how in Washington the title itself could be questioned. And the idea of just talking, when talking often means heady ideas, talking something to death, thinking that we'll have a resolution through some particular kind of conversation. And we all know that that's not true. And I was thinking, well, maybe it's more like engagement or discovering one another across divides, or something that was far more relational. And that's what I was hoping to push you all. And the other piece was the word divides. Recently, I've thought about this word quite a bit. Every time it comes up on the news, we're so divided. And I realize there's truly a media narrative of division that is being pushed. And that narrative is that we live within this binary division of the universe, of the reds and the blues. And there's two choices because, frankly, we live in a democracy where that's what we wind up having on the ballot. But I pointed out, and this goes to the history thing you just mentioned, Jemar, is that Americans have always been divided about everything. And any one of us here could could teach a class about the great divides in American history. And we could start way back in the colonial period, even before that. And so I said, this is really nothing new. What is new is the way that this particular narrative is being foisted upon us. Is there a better narrative? Is there a different way we can talk about division? And so I think that just sort of opened the door for maybe some more creative thinking on the subject. At least that's what I trusted you all to do.
Yes. You set it up. You just lobbed it up for us perfectly. And then, there was conversation back and forth between the panelists. You joined in, which I thought was great. It's not like you're just, sitting off to the side. And then, just building off of that concept of a divide, talking cross divisions. I'm like, we need to continue to name the thing. And to me, that thing in this race is race. So often, right? When we're looking at who's voting for who's supporting what policy, so often it's falling along racial lines and broad racial lines. It's like white majorities in various, sub-demographics of that. And then everyone else. Like, to me, like, that is, can we deal with that? Regardless of where you stand on policies, let's talk about the fact that we have white people and white Christians in particular in majorities supporting one candidate and everyone else, even though there's different levels of support, but still majorities not supporting him. That to me is a real good conversation piece. And along with that, I think there's the divides are increasingly stark, and they're not things that we can sort of agree to disagree on. We can't agree to disagree on the dehumanization of entire people groups. We can't agree to disagree on, in a democracy, whether we'll have the peaceful transfer of power, right? So much of my comments on that panel were trying to encourage people, like, you don't need to sit down at the table with everyone when you know what they're about and what you're about, and it's not compatible. And, I have this brand that I started called Justice Takes Sides. And I think there are times, particularly in moments of moral clarity on particular issues, where you have to take a side. And as Christians in the United States, particularly around evangelical Christians, it's so hard because we want to be nice Christians, right? And like taking a stand and taking a side, that seems divisive. That seems confrontational. Guess what? It is. And it needs to be. Somebody asked, I think they asked you, Robby, how have you seen change occur? What works, right? And you had a fabulous answer, and I jumped in as a historian. I'm like, confrontation. Yeah, like groups of the coalition of the willing coming together and saying, no, we will not stand for this. And this must be different. And we got, 40 some days to the election as we record this. And I just think, what was Jim Wallis's line? There's like, he wrote, in one of his books, there are people who, the line, Robby, people you can converse with and people you have to defeat.
Mm.
Yeah, you said that at the very beginning.
Okay.
That was a really good framing piece.
Yeah, we don't like that. We don't like to talk.
That's out of his recent book, The False White Gospel.
Right,
Yep.
right.
And that raised a really interesting question in this whole subject of talking about divides, and something that we had been talking about here, and that is the absolute call to truthfulness that is part of Christian discipleship. And then, just a couple of weeks ago in the lectionary, which my tradition reads, the Episcopal Church and Catholics and other liturgical churches, we read those in church every week. So a couple of weeks ago, it was from Ephesians 4, and the passage literally says, speak truth to your neighbors. That's where it begins. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, Paul is writing, or the guy pretending to be Paul is writing to our current election system. But then it goes on, and by the end, it weaves together truth with kindness. And it's like the least expected place where you think things to go. And I have not been able to, stop ruminating on what is the relationship. And it's exactly what you've been saying, between the idea of confronting lies, say, for example, in Springfield, Ohio, and standing up and saying, there's no both sides here. These people are being dehumanized, et cetera. Their lives are being destroyed. These are absolute fabrications that are being told for a point of power on the part of a few people. That all has to be said as forcefully and clearly as possible. And on the other hand, how does kindness, generosity, forgiveness, and mercy, all the things that show up in that Ephesians passage, how does that all show up in that context of confrontation? And so that's really something I've been struggling with personally.
Yeah. Can I jump in? Just 'cause this is something I've been struggling with too. And I wrote a little bit. I have a chapter in the last book, The Hidden Roots of White Supremacy, that's called Hope and History. And I realized that this idea, Jemar, that you're talking about, that change comes from confrontation, right? Highly discomforting. You don't really know where the outcome's going. Risk, like all of that is like real. Like, and of course we've had that from Douglas and others. Like power concedes nothing, right? Except when it's challenged, right? Without a struggle, when it's challenged. And it occurred to me that, like, even in the traditions so I grew up kind of white, evangelical, Southern Baptist in Mississippi, we weren't doing a lot of social justice work down as when I was growing up. But even when we quoted the verses like that you heard from Martin Luther King's speech, right? And I actually heard those verses more from Martin Luther King's speech than I heard from the pulpit, right? But let justice roll down like waters and righteousness as a mighty stream. But there was a way in which I heard that as a white, conservative, evangelical Christian as something magical that happens in the world without human effort, right? It just rolls down. It just comes.
Right. It's a work of God.
It's a work of God. That's right. It's a spiritual work of God.
Yes.
And the human agency and risk and struggle kind of fall out, right? And so if that's the theology, then when you run up against struggle, I realize you get hopeless really fast because you think it's just supposed to happen, right? It's not supposed to be this way. Righteousness is supposed to prevail. And so I think I've been like, for me, this was like a growth point in thinking like, oh, actually, no. But when you're not the one struggling for your rights, when you're struggling for your rights, you don't really have the option of saying, oh, this is hard. Okay, so let's stop. Right. But when you're not the one in that position, you can kind of go, oh man, yeah, this is hard and uncomfortable. And I don't want to make the people down the pew upset with me. And so let's not.
Especially when I think it was a little bit revelatory to some of the people in the audience that I always find myself speaking for white, mainline, non-evangelical Protestants at these events because there are so few of us at these events. But I pointed out how white middle-class culture that really, of the middle part of the 20th century, that truly shaped the statistics we're seeing now about white non-evangelical Protestants and how they're voting, has as really its primary moral virtue, niceness.
Yeah, or propriety. That's the other word.
I'm using all the syllables. Okay. Yeah. Prudence,
keep my P word.
These are all the P words too. And so, to be nice, to be polite. There's another P, but it's much shorter. And not to upset your neighbor. And that was really interesting because the white Catholic women jumped in and said, "Oh, that's true of middle class white Catholicism in the middle part of the 20th century as well." And those two cultures of middle class white Catholicism, middle class denominational based Protestantism, that's a kind of a long, haunting set of values. Many of those people are still alive. There are most seniors, and you see that those are the people who are most resistant to engaging the ideas we're putting here. And also among white people, it's the strongest pro-MAGA, pro-Trump voting group. So there's something in that using niceness and mistaking that for kindness.
I was going to ask, can we talk about the difference between that? Because I don't think in Christian circles we necessarily understand that really well.
Yeah, I mean, my sense is, and when I do preach on this, I talk about how kindness does tell the truth, but sometimes niceness will avoid it. And so it's very kind to let people know the historical stories that we are putting forth. It's very kind to make sure that people live connected to reality. But that's, if you're just being nice, you might say, oh, well, I kind of know they're misled or whatever, but I don't want to upset things. And so you're just sort of nice to them.
Yeah. It reminds me of MLK talking about, in some conceptions, peace being the absence of conflict, but not the presence of justice, right? Mm-hmm. So niceness is trying to avoid that conflict, but kindness, to me, we often talk about, love your neighbor as yourself, obviously beautiful and kind of a rule to live by. But in this political moment, I think a verse we should also remind ourselves of is speak the truth in love. Because there's so much about truth that is under attack right now. And there's also this couplet, truth with love, right? Or truth with kindness in the same vein. We can go on and on and on about this, but as we were meeting and talking about saving democracy, applying our Christian values to democracy, there was something else going on in DC, an attack on democracy, if you will, or at least on people groups. So let's talk about what was going on across town. Can somebody summarize here?
Oh, I'll just jump in. Yeah, so across town, there was motorcades going by not too far from where we were. We were at the new McCourt School at Georgetown, and it turns out that candidate Trump was attending an fighting anti-Semitism conference and speaking there. And while he was there, made some pretty interesting comments for an anti-Semitism conference, including blaming Jewish people if he loses, that if he loses, it'll be the Jews' fault, saying that if he lost, the state of Israel would be eradicated, and several times managed to work in that Democratic Senator Chuck Schumer was a Palestinian along the way.
So you're saying he did 3 anti-Semitisms in an anti-Semitism conference?
Yeah, it's a little much. Yeah.
What? How is he? What was his rationale? And Trump probably not the best words to use next to each other. But what was the idea behind if he loses, it's going to be the Jewish people's fault?
Well, he pointed to, I went and I looked at the context of the remarks, and he said, only 24% of American Jews voted for me, even though I have been the best president ever for Israel. And so that was where he went. He went to those statistics, and all I could think about was Robby. Because Jews make up about 2% of the overall population of the United States. They're largely concentrated in California and New York. The largest populations of Jews are in those 2 non-swing states that vote heavily Democratic all the time anyway. And so what he was talking about was 24% of 2%, and saying that somehow if all you Jews were just grateful enough to me, which is a terrible thing to say, and that was me pretending I was him, I would never say that. But if all the Jews who should be grateful to me voted for me, then I would win. But wait a second, we're only talking about 2% of the American people.
The math not mathing.
No, it's not math. It doesn't add up.
The other weird thing that's underneath this, again, if you kind of slow it all down, like every time Trump speaks to a Jewish group, you can tell there's this conception of him of who Jewish people are, right? And even that runs into anti-Semitism territory, because in his mind, right, they're citizens of Israel, even American Jews, right? And that's why he runs this line, is like, look at all I'm doing for your country, right? Is a way that he's talking to Jewish Americans, right? Not as Americans, but the sense that, like, I'm doing all this for your country over there in Israel, and yet you're not voting for me here. That's what doesn't compute in his mind, right? So there's just kind of this weird characterization, and Trump, he can't really think without putting ethnic groups in boxes, right? And this is the way it happens with American Jews, right? Is that they're, because that's an old anti-Semitic trope, right? That they're dual citizens, their loyalties are divided. Like, this has been used against Jewish Americans, like, over and over in American history. The same way it was with American Catholics, right? They get dual allegiances, they're loyal to the Pope, not just to the country. Same kind of line of thinking. But it's operational here, even when he's in front of like a group of American Jews.
And it's part of his quid pro quo view of the world, because if you think about the whole way that he's talked about black voters too, very similar. You should be grateful because black unemployment, those black jobs were just flourishing under me, and it is very much that same thing where ethnicities, people of certain kinds of backgrounds, people of certain kinds of religious perspectives, they're put into a box. And he always has all of the worst views of the people in those boxes, women included. We have a bigger box, but he doesn't speak too well of us and our capacities for making moral decisions and other things like that. And once he has that there, then he feels like he has executed policies that would benefit those people in that box. And then he just can't understand why they will not do the quid pro quo. I did this for you. Why don't you vote for me? And if you don't vote for me, you're being disloyal. And if you don't vote for me, you're going to cause me to lose this election.
Yeah.
I want to underscore, too, what we're really talking about here, right? Anti-Semitism from somebody, a former president who wants to again occupy the White House. And in front of that audience, this is the same campaign that is just stoking racism, nativism, anti-immigrant sentiments to a dangerous level. You mentioned Springfield, Ohio. This is what we are dealing with. And on the one hand, we're kind of dissecting each instance. But I just want to, a historian here say that this isn't unprecedented, but in terms of recent history, right, we are reaching new levels of kind of this hate speech and fomenting and just stoking bitterness, resentment, and mistrust, and really trying to drive those divisions, right? We see that with J.D. Vance, where truth does not matter because this is working for them, because what works for them is stoking fear in the hearts of particular Americans and telling them that these newcomers are going to take something that rightfully belongs to you. I mean, that's what's at the heart of racism. It's this kind of white racial identity that says, hey, if anybody else comes alongside, you're going to lose something. You don't want to lose something, do you? Right. And so seeing this being actively stoked throughout this campaign is something we have to call out. It's an issue of truth. It's an issue of justice, and it's exceedingly dangerous. And I've been hearing a lot, particularly in faith communities these days, good people who are trying to speak into this moment. And in more conservative or moderate communities, that is a difficult thing to do. But I've been hearing a lot of this kind of both sides language, right? Which is coming back to what you were talking about, Jemar, and your, justice takes sides. And on some of these issues that we're talking about today, and many of the driving issues in this presidential campaign, we need to be very clear. And even when it comes to talking about divides and polarization, we have scholars can tell us this is an asymmetrical polarization. And I think we need to acknowledge that and keep that in front of folks, particularly folks in Christian spaces who are trying to address this without alienating half of their community, when sometimes you just have to say what's true.
There is as soon as you say that, I'm thinking not only of Trump, but I'm thinking about how this is impacting throughout the whole system. And that's one of the things that keeps me up at night, is that once the election is over, say Kamala Harris wins even by, a few votes or a landslide or whatever, this moment is going to be part of our history. It's going to stay imprinted on our identity as a nation, and how it continues is going to be an issue going forward. But I'm thinking specifically about the complex thing that just happened while we were together as well, about Mark Robinson, the governor's candidate in North Carolina. Oh my gosh. Talk about just levels of fabrication, levels of race. And so CNN did some hardcore tech research and discovered comments and texts, I guess, and things that he had said and written online 10 to 12 years ago. And you cannot change by AI or by backdating things that exist on the internet that you wrote 10 to 12 years ago. Is actually impossible, at least as of right now. All of these things were reprehensible. Referring to himself as a black Nazi, all kinds of very pornographic and terrible things that I do not wish to say, insults against trans people. I mean, it's just really, really, really bad. What was interesting to me is that he came out, and this is in North Carolina, and said, well, this is really just a high-tech lynching, quoting that Clarence Thomas from all those years ago. And I really needed you all to talk about this, because as soon as I heard that, I went, oh my gosh, talk about the layers of American history. When you bring up, oh, you're a black man and you called yourself a black Nazi, and you bring up high-tech lynching in North Carolina, which was one of the states with the highest number of people who were lynched. You can see, I have no words.
Right. I mean, they say, it's bad in the article where they give a disclaimer at the front, like, watch out because this article contains explicit language and all of this stuff. This is, with Mark Robinson, a case of internalized racism and self-hatred. To call yourself a black Nazi, he said, I would have joined the KKK, but they don't let black people in. He excoriates Martin Luther King as an effing commie, all of these things, right? And then there's the lewdness, right? A lot of these comments are made on pornographic sites. He's commenting on when he was peeping on a lady's changing room. He went back the next day to do it again, would have done it again, but they blocked off the entrance. It is just lurid, right? And there's so many layers to this. One, does character count anymore, right? In leaders, right? Let alone elected officials. And then two is the sort of backhanded racism of a majority white Republican Party putting forth these black men. I'm thinking of Herschel Walker now as well, in Georgia, running against Raphael Warnock a few years ago. And now Mark Robinson, we can name others. I mean, Clarence Thomas himself, right? Who represent the worst of human character in a lot of ways, but are black. And we are still often judged as a group. So the actions of a few reflect on the many. And we have brilliant people like Kamala Harris, at the very least, whatever you think of their politics, at least people who take the role seriously, have some prudence, some temperance, if we want to use all these old school virtues, right? And I consider it a form of racism to put up these folks who we know aren't qualified just to sort of watch them fail. But they're hurting their own cause, right? Because he's trailing in the polls in the gubernatorial race in North Carolina. And this certainly won't help. But it was just mind-boggling. And he's not dropping out of the race. And I mean, what did y'all think?
Well, when Trump wants you to drop out, you're in trouble.
Did he say that?
Did he say that?
I think there's been some pressure behind the scenes. I'm not sure he's made a public comment about it, but there's been some pressure behind the scenes to get him to drop. And it doesn't look, because I think they all are reading the polls and thinking, oh man, and North Carolina, right? One of the states is really going to matter in this election. In fact, some of the ways that the Electoral College math works, that like if Trump loses North Carolina, it really shuts down his pathway, right, to the presidency.
Yeah.
And so it's a really critical state for Trump to win.
Well, you asked what we think, and one of the things that makes me very angry is the fact that, and I hadn't quite thought about it. In effect, you're setting up black men. Oftentimes, this happens with women too. Setting up kind of third-rate women leaders, and if they win, then they're in office, and then they're a third-rate leader. And if they lose, you say, "Oh, women." They can't run anything. I've seen that a million times. And so it's a very cynical ploy on the part of some organizations and political parties when they do this. It's a form, I think, of tokenism. At its worst. But then it does something that's really tied to what Kristin was just saying as well. It really reinforces those racial stereotypes that have been built about these people, because there's going to be a certain number of white people in North Carolina who see all of this and say, oh, well, what do you expect of a black man? And that, or if it was a woman, it's like, well, they tried to do it to Kamala Harris. A woman who doesn't get married till she's 50, trying to act as if she had been the Virgin Mary with her sex life before she got married. And so they try to dig up every single relationship she ever had and make her look like a slut. Mm-hmm, so it's a form of, in effect, slut shaming that becomes a kind of a box. And it's kind of racializing that the worst kind of stereotype Americans held, I think, in our history about black men. And so, some idiot who really is a poorly behaved human being and has clearly problems around his sexuality gets in there. And then some person in North Carolina who's white and who believes those kinds of stereotypes says, see, I told you. And then that affects the future of all black men and their success. And that makes me really angry.
Exactly. Same here. And we have to be on our guard as citizens, as people who are engaging in politics, because it's so unfortunate that I think really the line for whether he should withdraw or not is he winning in the polls, not what he did, right? Like, so a lot we can say on all of these things. I want to kind of bring us to a close on a more constructive end, and
good call.
Thinking about
there's a lot in the news right now.
There's so much in the news right now. We need a 3-hour-long show. But thinking about going back to this idea of truth telling, that being a form of kindness, that being a form of even loving your neighbor. Kristin, you've done a pretty big project around truth telling, and we would love to know about it and be able to support it.
Thanks, Jemar. Yes, this week, Thursday, is the release of a film that I have produced called For Our Daughters. And it is a film on the sex abuse inside evangelical churches, on the survivors who have called it out at great, immense personal cost. I'm talking about Krista Brown, Jules Woodson, Tiffany Thigpen, and Kate West, and others who have spoken truth to power, some for decades, to try to bring reform, to try to protect other children and women. And so For Our Daughters, we have an Emmy award-winning director who directed this. It's a documentary short, so just 30 minutes. It's free on YouTube. It will be free at forourdaughtersfilm.com. We wanted it to be barrier-free so that any woman can watch it anywhere she is. And I'll just say a quick word about the title, For Our Daughters. Oh, first I should say, so it's about the sex abuse crisis and the failure to address abuse when it does occur, the cover-ups, the blaming the women over and over again. And it delves into both a theological context for that and a wider political context. So we go there. We frame this in terms of Christian nationalism, because it turns out that some of the very same preachers who are preaching Christian nationalism are the same ones who are preaching the submission of women and male patriarchal authority and ends justifies the means theology and politics. And the survivors themselves are drawing this connection, saying, we lived this. We know what it's like when things go wrong in these spaces. And trust us, these are not the men that you want in charge of our country. And so it's a message to women inside churches and women outside of churches, women in this country, citizens of this country, a real call to action. And the title of the film, For Our Daughters, actually came about in a couple of different ways. a couple of the survivors in the film, actually what motivated them to go public and to speak out was when they had daughters of their own. And when their own daughters came to the age that they were when they were victimized, and they realized they had been blamed. They had been blamed as girls, as young women, for their own for their own abuse. And the predators, I mean, one of them, Krista, had been made to apologize to the wife of her rapist. And then when she had her own daughter, she thought, no way, no way. And then could understand, and then was motivated to go public and to fight for reform, to fight for justice. And just weeks after Jesus and John Wayne released, because this film is based on the last chapter of Jesus and John Wayne, I was contacted by 3 conservative evangelical women of some standing. I recognized their names when they reached out to me. And I thought that they were contacting me because they had some issues with the book, right? Jesus and John Wayne, how white evangelicals corrupted a faith, fractured a nation. I thought they'd want to say, okay, you took this a little too far. I was wrong. They said, thank you, Kristin. Thank you for what you have done. And then they said, it is too late for us. We have made our choices, and we are living the lives that we have made. We can't walk away from our lives, but we want something different for our daughters. And so I've taken those words with me, and that's what this film is about. And that is who this film is for. So it releases Thursday on YouTube at forourdaughters.com. We're going to have it on another site that is built for group screenings, virtual screenings, so you can grab some friends, women in your church, perhaps in a book club, family members, and you can host a virtual screening yourself or an in-person screening. Bring people together, watch the film, listen to their words, and then think about what you maybe want to do.
So that's all free?
It's all free.
Oh,
no
fantastic.
barriers. Accessible to everybody.
Well, I know this work takes a lot out of you, so thank you. I mean, you wrote the book, and then building on top of it, I think it's freeing a lot of people. And it's really difficult work, this truth telling, because you are open to those attacks. And it's also draining as you sort of share this testimony and this burden. But I am grateful. As a man, definitely, I want to watch this and become more aware and hopefully supportive of women across the board. So thank you for doing that.
It's always a great kindness to shine a light into dark corners.
That's what we're talking about, truth and kindness. And we're not done. We have more coming for you. I'm really excited about this. Robby, would you give us a little teaser of the more truth telling that we're going to do?
Yeah, we're wrapping up here. Yeah, sure. So just quickly, so we're here all in person in Washington, D.C., and we, like I said, we're usually in our little Zoom boxes, but we thought it might be fun to take it on the road. So yes. Heads up, we may be coming, well, we are coming to
we mean it.
Some towns near you. So we will be, dates to be disclosed later, but we are coming to Greensboro, North Carolina, and to Tempe, Arizona, coming soon, and maybe more. But we'll keep you posted. But the Convocation Unscripted coming out on the road this fall.
We're doing a road show. We'll be live in person. I cannot wait to do this.
And we'll have music.
Yeah. That's the most amazing part. We're going to have
a band.
It's going to be a fun time. So stay tuned on that.
Absolutely. We will have more word and more details about that. With that, we're gonna bring this live in person first ever episode of the Convocation Unscripted to a close. Thank you so much to my co-hosts, Butler Bass, Kristin Du Mez, and Robby Jones. And please follow all of our Substacks and on social media. We're still on there putting spice out there. All of that stuff is in the show notes. And make sure that you subscribe, of course, to this show. Our producer is Bo York, with support and production services provided by Podastery. Thanks again for listening. And with that said, this episode of the Convocation Unscripted is officially adjourned. See you next time.